Hi everyone, this is lecture 8.1 in our social problems class. Today we'll be talking about crime and criminal justice. So, in this lecture we will be defining criminality. We will tell us what the statistics tell us about criminal justice or criminality. We'll talk about types of crimes, the criminal justice system itself, and some theory we can use to try to explain crime. In terms of content warnings, we will be talking about jail and prisons. Additionally, we will be talking about problems in policing, including police brutality. If you're really interested in this material, I suggest that you take either a criminology or a deviance course. In those courses, we talk specifically about this material. Being a social problems course, we're only touching on it just for this week. Before we move forward, though, we have to define the difference between criminology and criminal justice. Criminology is a subdiscipline of sociology. In such, it is the scientific study of why people commit crime and how their social settings contribute to crime. Criminal justice, then, is the study of how we apprehend and convict criminals, also the study of what to do with criminals after they're convicted. Since, obviously, this is a sociology course, we will be taking a criminology approach to the material. But before we can actually start with the criminology or deviance approach, we have to define yet more definitions. Namely the definition of norms, which you may remember from Soc 101, which are the rules of behavior in society based on what we value, the things that we feel are important. Deviance then is defined as behavior that breaks the rules or norms of society. Laws then are defined as norms that have been codified into law, namely norms that have been written down into official rules. And the laws of society typically reflect the values, but sometimes they don't. If a given society has so many laws that are not backed up by the morality of society, what society thinks are important, then that could indicate a major problem with a democracy. Crime, then, is simply defined as the violation of a law. It should be pointed out that something that is deviant is not always criminal. Not wearing pants on the subway, for example, may look really weird, but the reality of the matter is that is not criminal, at least within New York City. Something that is criminal, however, is not always deviant. Jaywalking, speeding, other kinds of traffic crimes, those are often not backed up by what we think is moral behavior. We don't think someone is a bad person necessarily if they jaywalk. So let's look a little bit as far as what statistics tell us about criminal justice, criminology, and deviance. One of the key definitions that we need to understand these crime statistics are what the FBI labels as Part 1 crimes. These are major crimes included in the Uniform Crime Reports, which are a very important document in studying the realm of criminology. These include homicide, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, major motor theft, and arson. These are crimes that are absolutely a violation of norms. Nearly everybody in society sees these crimes as being deviant, as being a problem. The Uniform Crime Report, then, is the FBI's regular compilation of crime statistics, and for the most part, the UCR are Part 1 crimes. The National Crime Victims Survey, then, is an annual survey conducted by the U.S. Department of Justice, and it asks a representative sample of the American public about crimes that they personally have suffered. Put most simply, the Uniform Crime Reports are crime statistics put together by the FBI, while the National Crime Victims Survey is a survey that was done independent of law enforcement or police departments. Naturally, not every crime is reported. That is something that is taken into consideration when analyzing or considering criminal behavior or crime statistics in a given area. But if the UCR is significantly higher than official statistics, it indicates either corruption in a local police department or law enforcement in general, or a strong distrust of police in a given community. There's a concept known as the dark figure of crime. This is the large number of crimes that do not come to the attention of police and thus do not come to the attention of the public. These may decrease as the public trust of police increases. So if in an area the public trusts the police and they report a lot of things to the police, that will drive the dark figure of crime down. However, if you're in an area where the public very strongly distrusts the police, then the dark figure of crime will go up. A self-report survey, then, is a survey given to individuals, usually adolescents. This type of survey asks about the offenses that an individual may have committed. It may ask the person about their families or some other aspects of their lives. This data can be really useful to help develop programs that may be able to prevent crime in the future. However, if you are looking at a self-report survey that is being conducted among teenagers, it is important to point out a very specific phenomena among teen crime is that they tend to over-exaggerate. So, basically because of the chemical balance of most teens' brains. If you ask them, for example, tell us about your sexual experience or how many times you have had sex, those who haven't had sex may tend to say, yes, of course I've had sex. Those who have had some kind of sexual activity may be likely to exaggerate that as well. And we see that with sex, with violent crime, with shoplifting. Teens have a tendency to claim they do things more than the average population. It's kind of a quirk of the teenage brain. Now let's talk about some types of crime. So crime can be broken up into several categories. One category is blue-collar crime. This is often known what we think of as street crime. These are the crimes we most commonly think of as crime, including burglary, mugging, bank robbery, and drug dealing. Then we have consensual crime. This is illegal behavior in which people participate voluntarily and could include things like drug use, prostitution, and gambling. A consensual crime may also be a blue-collar crime, just to point that out. Then we have organized crime. Organized crime is criminal activity by groups or organization whose major purpose is for the existing organization to commit a crime. And I do apologize for the weird typo on that slide. White-collar crime, then, is defined as crime committed by high-status individuals or groups with the privilege that they already exert in society. This concept was most closely associated with sociologist Edwin Sutherland that did most of his work in the 1930s and 40s. White-collar crime is broken up into three general categories, and this will be addressed in greater detail in Lecture 9.1. First, we have corporate deviance, which is deviant behavior that directly benefits from the company or individuals within that company. So basically, it's when a corporation does a crime. Then we have occupational deviance, which is deviant behavior done by a person with access to resources of their profession. An example of this could be maybe a bank teller stealing money out of the bank just because they have access in their job. Then we have governmental deviance, which is deviant behavior that benefits the government or those who are in power. Hypothetically, government deviance should be less common in democracies because those who are in power are accountable to the general public and are relatively easy to get rid of. In reality, though, we all know that governmental deviance does occur within democracies. Now let's talk for a bit about the criminal justice system itself. Societies are structured to respond to deviance. Thus, a violation of a norm is responded to with sanctions. Sanctions may be either formal or informal. Thus, sanctions are the things we do to people when they commit an act of deviance. An example of an informal sanction is giving someone a dirty look, or maybe saying something to them about that thing. The most common formal sanction in our society is to put somebody in prison. Those who consider the criminal justice system can be placed into two broad camps. Let me rephrase that because I don't quite like the wording there in my slide. When we think about the criminal justice system, people can be put into two broad camps. There can be those that see the criminal justice system as needing to apply a get tough approach, which is the use of a long prison term and other law enforcement to reduce crime. Basically, what we're trying to do is punishing people for doing the thing that was a violation of the law. An example of this are three strikes laws. Three strikes laws became quite popular politically in the late 1990s. In these laws, individuals would be hit with a much stronger prison sentence after they commit a third crime on this list of crimes that are on the three strikes laws, thus hypothetically punishing them much stronger if they prove themselves to be a career criminal. And that kind of mindset of if we punish people super hard, then they won't commit crime, that is a get tough approach mindset. The alternative to that is a public health approach mindset, which highlights the needs to prevent illnesses or disease, or to look at criminality as a disease to be cured as opposed to a behavior to be punished. The public health approach contends that there is a need to address the factors that lead to criminal behavior, and this philosophical approach is the base that makes up the discipline of criminology. A get tough approach is more common among criminal justice approaches. Sorry about that slide. There was a bit of a blip there. Police brutality, especially that is driven toward young African American men, has been of particular interest to the general public in recent years. Much of that violence can be blamed on what we call implicit bias. You may have heard this term. It's part of our public discourse, but it's good to define it. Implicit bias is defined as a subconscious prejudice that most people have. So from this standpoint, most people are sexist in kind of an implicit bias way. Other people are racist. Other people could be homophobic, anti-Semitic, whatever. Most people have some kind of prejudice they are not aware that they have, even those of us who are politically and ideologically opposed to those things. It's absolutely everybody. However, when it becomes a problem is when it occurs in moments of stress. When we are stressed either psychologically or physically, or we're having a tough time, that is when implicit bias is most likely to flare. And that is especially dangerous among police officers who have to make life and death calls. So if a police officer gets scared about a situation and then their perceptions are altered due to their preconceptions of a neighborhood or maybe preconceptions of a suspect, and then the officer acts on those preconceptions and misperceptions, that is a very dangerous moment in which, unfortunately, the bias in that police officer's brain leads to a very ugly moment in our society. This does not mean that police are any more or less racist than the rest of us. What it does mean is that they, just like us, hold these biases in our heads, and very unfortunately, when they hold those biases in their heads, it can lead to dangerous moments. So the question automatically becomes, how can we do something about this? And what can we do about this? Many police departments have recognized that police implicit bias is a problem, and that is a tremendous improvement to even recognize that it is a problem. That wouldn't have happened in previous generations. And luckily, new recruits are often specifically trained on how to avoid implicit bias, and that's great. Unfortunately, the informal training between veteran officers and new officers often negates that implicit bias training. And this is a phenomena that we see in many disciplines, in many lines of work, not just police and policing, where a older, more veteran worker said, okay, you just listened to all that HR stuff, but let me tell you about how it really actually is. Well, that mindset, when we're talking about police, or really probably any profession, can undermine the sensitivity training that comes with implicit bias training, and then really makes it very difficult to try to inoculate police from the implicit bias that's in their brains. After suspects are processed by police and local jails, the courts do come into play. As a point of clarification, at this point I want to define the difference between jail and prison, because a lot of us often use them as synonyms, and they're not the same thing. A jail is defined as a holding place where people are put after they are either arrested or until their family can post bail for their being released. So if your family can give an amount of money to be held in your place, then you can get out of jail. If you can't, then you have to stay in jail until your trial. Prison then is the long-term holding facilities where people are kept during their sentence. So jail is the holding place, and then prison is where people actually do their sentences if they are found guilty. There are innocent people who regularly go to jail, and that's part of the system. Prisons, hypothetically, should only be holding the guilty. Part of the job of a defense attorney then, well, let me redefine prosecutors, I'm sorry, because these are also terms that unless you're involved in the law, you're not super familiar with. A prosecutor is a lawyer for the state. They often include as many charges as they can to defend, to make sure subjects go to prison. That is part of the dynamic of the criminal justice system, is that the prosecutor tries as hard as they can to put the person in prison, again, because they're trying to do their job. A defense attorney then, part of their job is not only to defend their client, but to plea bargain with the prosecutor. What's a plea bargain? Well, this is an agreement between the prosecution and the defense that a criminal defendant will plead guilty, usually in return for a reduced sentence. So what does that mean? Well, even if the client of the defense says, I'm not guilty, I didn't do it, they could be encouraged to plead guilty so that they can get a better deal out of the situation. So it is entirely possible for charges to be brought up against you. You didn't do anything, but in order to avoid going to jail, you could be forced to say, yes, Your Honor, I did it, I plead guilty, and then with that kind of a plea, then they will let you go if you say you did it. But if you refuse to say you did it, and then they prosecute you, and then they find you guilty, you could go to jail because you keep saying, well, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. It's a troubling dynamic in our criminal justice system. And this is a major area in which privilege can have an amazing influence. For example, if you have loads of money, you can afford a better defense attorney. People who don't have any money then have to use public appointed attorneys who do their best job they possibly can, but they may not necessarily be the absolute best attorney. And for example, people who are members of discriminated against groups are less likely to be wealthy, and thus that is another area where the criminal justice system definitely has some problematic racist and classist and everything else-ist problems with the system itself. The criminal justice system is not necessarily inherently more broken than the rest of society, but it's definitely an area where those problems are more visible, and they're more visceral, if you will. It's easier to see the problems. Once the individual is sentenced, they are fully entered into what is called by academics. They don't, the prison systems don't call it this, but academics often call the prison system the prison industrial complex. The definition there being the term used by critics of the prison system to determine the interconnection between prisons, the employees of those facilities, the vendors that sell to those facilities, capitalism itself, governments, and other institutions. The existence of privately owned prisons are of special interest to critics who level that the prison system is this money-making apparatus. And the existence of private prisons is of a special concerning because they are driven by profit motive. So decisions can be made to make money as opposed to making decisions that are for the greatest good to society itself. Critics also point out that prisons not only punish individuals, but they also punish communities that those individuals are associated with. These effects are called the tertiary effects of imprisonment, and these claims are backed up by social disorganization theory. That is defined as weakening of social bonds and conventional social institutions with a community that causes crime rates to rise. So if enough people from a given community are taken out of the community and put into prisons, then the community gets worse and worse and worse, and thus as it gets worse, more people are driven to crime and go to prisons, and then this causes some areas to kind of spiral out of control and fall apart. Some of the examples of the tertiary impacts of imprisonment are what's called secondary incarceration. These are the hassles and problems that loved ones of the imprisoned must deal with in order to maintain their relationship with their loved ones. So traveling to faraway prisons, paying for collect calls from prisons, everything you would need to do to help your loved one or your family member while they are in prison, those are all the impacts of secondary incarceration. The concept there being that someone outside of prison is also being punished, not just the person inside of prison. Recidivism is another problem with a tertiary impact of prison. These are the crimes that someone commits after they are released from prison, which this wouldn't necessarily be considered an impact of imprisonment if it was purely all about an individual choosing to continue a life of crime. The reality is that studies show that inmates released from prison are more likely to commit crime if their former social networks are no longer present. So if someone is released from prison and all of their relationships, because they were in prison, are severed, they don't have a community anymore, they don't have a job anymore, they don't have a house, they don't have a career, well then such a person can become very desperate, and if they know how to do crime and that's the only thing they know how to do, then they are much more likely to wind up with recidivism. And thus reintegrating ex-cons is critical for the reform process. We need to find as a society a way to fix people while they're in prison, not just put them in the prison to rot effectively. So let's look for a couple minutes at the theory of who becomes criminals. One of the major concerns of criminologists is what is the difference between a criminal and a non-criminal. Well, there are three big theories in sociology that explain this. One of them is anomie strain theory. This suggests that deviance is caused by failure to achieve the American dream of financial success through conventional means of working. Basically, what this states is that when somebody is unable to get a conventional job in order to get money, then they will try to go do different things. So thus, if you want money but you can't get a job and you choose to commit crime instead of getting a job that you're unable to get, then that may be why you commit crime, right? You're just trying to get the same money everybody else can because you don't have those opportunities. Then we have differential association theory. This states that deviance stems from interaction with people we know who commit acts of deviance and who have values conducive to deviance. Basically, this is a moment where sociological theory actually matches up with common folk knowledge, where your mom said to you when you were in high school, if you hang out with bad kids, you'll have bad behavior. That's true in this instance. We learn what is and is not acceptable from the people we associate with. Differential association. We tell the difference because of the people we associate with. So if your friends in high school think it's completely normal to study for an hour before school, then you will think that is also completely normal. If, on the other hand, your friends are doing shots in the bathroom between classes, then you will think that is more normal as well. And then we have social bonding theory, which states that deviance results from weak bonds to conventional institutions such as family and schools, effectively saying if our connections with other human beings isn't that strong, then we will have a greater tendency to actually commit crime because those relationships won't matter as much and we will be more willing to harm society as a whole. In contrast, labeling theory observes that deviance is very common and most people have actually committed acts of criminal deviance at one kind or another. The question then becomes, what happens to people who get caught, right? So this makes the argument that all of us have committed primary deviance. So these are the minor, probably, sometimes major, laws that we break, and the vast majority of us never get caught. But if you do get caught, and then you are labeled as being a criminal, you will then start to take on the mindset of, well, everyone thinks I am a criminal, therefore I must be a criminal. And then after you have taken on that identity of I am a criminal, those crimes after that point are secondary deviance. So those are the crimes you do after you start to think yourself as being a criminal. Primary deviance, just to restate, is the stuff you do before you are labeled as being a criminal. And then finally, let's look at a couple of the macro level causes of criminality. These are thinking of crime on the big scale. Group conflict theory states that criminal law is shaped by the conflict among various social groups in society that exist because of differences in race, ethnicity, social class, religion, or other factors. What's that saying? Well, it says that if a group is discriminated against on a mass scale, then they will be underprivileged. And by virtue of being underprivileged, people in that group will be more likely to commit crime in order to survive. So therefore, that is why people in discriminated against groups may be more likely to commit crime, but it also makes the argument that the people who are in power benefit from that dynamic by being able to point to those groups and say, see, you see them, you see that those people are the bad guys and we are the good guys, that sort of thing. Radical theory, then, relating to criminology, highlights the importance of economic and social classes more than the importance of religion and ethnicity and other social group characteristics in shaping the creation and operation of criminal law. So this is actually pretty similar to both classical Marxist theories and group conflict theory. What it's making the argument over is that it's not as much race, ethnicity, religion, etc. It really is all about economic status and economic oppression. Those other things are kind of on the side. And this is very similar to classical Marxist ideas, not even necessarily modern Marxist concepts. Okay, well that is that whole set of concepts, and I hope you found this interesting. If you have any questions, please let me know.